like take care up to the introduction and then you can start with the questions.
Yeah, that I would love that. That
Okay,
would be
great.
excellent for me.
Yeah, got you.
Doing too many things at one time.
Yeah.
Are we live?
Like, take care up to.
Okay. All right. So I'm going to start the webinar now.
Mm-hmm.
So people should be able to join. Oh, I see one attendee.
Claire, do you need to demote me from panelists so my my head is not up there? Or are we good?
I think it's fine because you'll be off when your video's off, you disappear from the YouTube stream and then you're on the bottom, you'll stay on the bottom of this. So I think it's
awesome. Okay, cool. Just making sure. Good luck, everyone.
Should we give it another minute and then we can start? Okay. Okay, I think we can start. Hello and welcome everyone. Good morning. So welcome to our science on our panel for science communication. As I think it's we have been doing this for a while now, and EPSP Connects is a science and is a monthly seminar series that alternate between EPSP related science talks and professional development panels. And these events are virtually held via Zoom. And we had launched EPSP Connects during the COVID-19 pandemic, but we intend to continue these seminars on a monthly basis into whatever new normal emerges. And so here we are with our first panel discussion for 2021 and our second EPSP Connects series component. So as we have seen in the earlier panel discussions as well, so the idea is we have a panelist, we have a great selection of panelists here to discuss about science communication. And the idea is that we have a set of questions that we are going to direct these questions to either to some of the panelists, and everyone will get a chance to give their thoughts about this and discuss. And if we have some time at the end, we can get to some of the questions that the audience can post in the chat. And so that's about it. So the audience, you're very welcome to post questions in the chat, and we'll get to that if we have some time at the end. Okay, so without further ado, let's just jump into today's seminar. And today's panel is focused on how we communicate our science, both in and beyond our scientific communities. And we are so excited to hear from our excellent panel that we have assembled here today. Now I'll just go around and ask the panelists to introduce themselves and also give us a little bit of brief idea about how about their path into science communication, and also what does science communication look for them? How do they define science communication? Maybe we can start with Amy. Do you want to?
Good morning.
Good morning.
My name is Amy East. I am a research geologist with the U.S. Geological Survey based in California. And I'm the editor-in-chief of the Journal of Geophysical Research, Earth Surface, which I've been doing for AGU for a little over 2 years now. Before that, I was an associate editor with JGR, and I also ran another journal as editor-in-chief for 5 years. I really enjoy the whole process of writing scientific papers, and I really enjoy editing other work by others. And the reason that I enjoy that the most, I would say, is that I love the process of taking your work and bringing it into its best form, the form in which you can best express the importance of your work and its relevance for others. I find it a lot of fun. So I guess my perspective for the questions that you've prepared for the panel is with my journal editor hat on mostly, and as an author. And you asked us to define science communication. It's harder than I would have thought from when I sat down to think about this answer. Explaining the context and the importance of scientific findings, both to people who share and who don't share your expertise. And we all find that I think we adapt communication depending on whether you're talking to a colleague with similar topical expertise, to another scientist with different expertise, or to a non-scientist, or to a journalist. And I would put journalists in a very different category from any of the others there. And that those communication skills need to encompass all of those depending on the situation. Thanks.
Thank you so much, Amy. That's a great perspective on how you look at science communication. Becca, do you want to jump in?
Sure. So I'm Becca Dzonbek, weird last name. I am a 5th-year grad student in Earth and Environmental Sciences at the University of Michigan. I've been freelance science writing for a couple of years now, and I'm also currently serving as the Science Communication Fellow for the Geological Society of America. And I actually have a bit of a background in writing. I have a communication studies undergraduate degree, as well as geology. And so it's sort of taken my whole PhD to sort of be able to combine the two finally in science writing. And I actually got into it through, in a very roundabout way. I was the director of communications for the Association of Women in Science chapter at my university. And through that, I kept trying to sort of shoehorn in science communication into finally, I was like, okay, this just isn't the right outlet for this. So I founded a blog where I still actually edit and basically just help women in science, Women Plus in Science on our campus sort of tell their stories, how they would like them to be told. And so that editing process has actually been really rewarding. But beyond that, I just, I like being able to explore cool science outside the narrow confines of what sort of grad school and academia more broadly sort of demand. And for defining science communication, like Amy, at first I was like, well, it's communicating science. But once I started to think more about it, I actually think it's interesting to define it in a goal-oriented way. So depending on who you're talking to, you're going to use different sort of methods and approaches, but it's through a framework of, okay, why are you talking to this group? What are you trying to do? If you're talking with an uncle and you're trying to convince him that climate change is real and he should get an electric car, that's very different from trying to, say, connect with a community about a public health concern, an environmental justice issue, versus, just talking with a journalist because there's some cool research on zebras that is just interesting and fun. So I think it's interesting to define it in that way. Yeah.
Thank you so much, Becca. Catherine, do you want to introduce yourself?
Hello, I'm Catherine. I am a scientist turned science journalist. So I have a PhD in astronomy that I finished up a couple of years ago. And it was only at the end of grad school that I started thinking to myself, maybe I don't want to stay in academia. I love the research I did, but I realized that there were about 50 people in the world who read and understood my thesis. And I think I wanted to have more of an impact. I was curious about so many different fields of science, both within astronomy and beyond astronomy. So I was one of those grad students who actually liked writing papers. And I took that as a sign that maybe I should do something combining writing and science. So after I finished my PhD, there was a lot of soul searching. I was trying to figure out what I possibly wanted to do next. I had heard of this field called science journalism, but really didn't know a lot about it. So I reached out to as many people as I could, people whose work I read, just sent them an email and just said, hey, how do you do this? How did you get into this field? What is it like? What is fun? What is not fun about it? And that was extremely informative for me. And my very first paying job was I was writing summaries of research articles for a physics society. So I was using my background in physics. That was what got me started. And I've been freelancing since then. So meaning that I write for a whole variety of different publications. I'm not committed to just one outlet. And I do a lot of writing for AGU's EOS and Science and Scientific American and the New York Times and a whole range of places. And it's been really a lot of fun. I've learned a ton about how to take something that's super technical and break it down into something that's approachable and interesting, newsworthy, trying to figure out what is going to capture the attention of somebody who doesn't have a PhD in science, but is still interested in science. So to me, science communication is very much that process of taking something that a scientist cares about, which might not be something that the general public cares about, and pulling out the little nuggets that the public does want to hear about. So what's the relevance to everyday life? Why is this neat? What are we learning? How does this tell us about the process of science? So to me, it's that distillation of transferring from audience A, which is scientists, to audience B, which is the public.
Thank you so much. That was really, I really like that distilling of knowledge. Charlie, do you want to introduce yourself?
Sure, I'm happy to go next. I'm Charlie Shobe, and I'm a new assistant professor at West Virginia University. And gosh, if 50 people read my thesis, I would be surprised. I'm a geomorphologist like most of us, but I'm here in my role as one of the founders and editors-in-chief of GeoBytes, which is a geoscience communication website run by a group of volunteer science writers and generously funded by AGU. This is a community of writers who largely are practicing geoscientists for their day jobs, like me, but who enjoy writing about recent advances in the field for a general audience. So I'm really here representing a team that now consists of about 25 really fantastic science writers from all over the world. And in the about 1 year we've been running, our sort of 1 year birthday is next month, we've published 75 pieces of science writing. And I really came to this kind of the way we currently run things at GeoBytes, where science communication was a fun hobby for me. I spent a lot of time reading the work of John McPhee and Stephen Jay Gould and these other kind of canonical, well-known science writers, as well as more recent folks to Elizabeth Colbert, and even people within our own community, right? Like Dr. Ellen Wohl at Colorado State, who's published lots of fantastic books about the science that she and her group do. And so I really came to this as thinking, oh, well, this will be something different and fun. And that's how it continues to be for me. I've never made substantial amounts of money from science writing, but I do certainly enjoy it. And it's a nice break from the more technical writing. So to define science communication for me from that perspective, just as somebody who kind of runs one of these informal communication outlets, I really think of it as just simply trying to keep the wider world apprised of what we're up to as practicing scientists. And that includes kind of what we're working on, how we conduct our science on a day-to-day basis, whether that's field work, lab work, computer stuff, whatever it is you might do. Why it matters, of course, that's kind of how you grab people and pull them in. And then ultimately, and I don't think it's cynical to bring this up, but ultimately, where is all the money going that we take to do this work, right? And it's important to think about those broader implications, where if we're repeatedly asking the taxpayers for money to do this science, I think it's important to provide a return on that by showing them what we've been up to. So for me, it's sort of that functional goal of just kind of keeping people apprised of what we do as scientists.
Great. Thank you, Charlie. And thank you to all of our panelists, both for being here and also for your thoughtful definitions of science communication. I agree that it seemed obvious at first, but the more you think about it, it really highlights all the different facets and ways in which we talk about science across our networks. And so to build on that, as you all hit on in your definitions, we communicate both inside our science, both inside and outside of our scientific communities. And so to kick this first question off to Becca and Charlie, what similarities and differences do you see broadly between those two types of communication?
I can start off. A similarity for me, I feel like, is there are two things you never want to assume, basically, no matter who you're talking to or why you're talking to them, which is like, don't assume that they know anything, basically, and also don't assume that they're interested. It's your job, through whether it's writing or a podcast or a conference talk, you have to motivate your work well and in a way that's applicable to whoever is listening. If it's technical audience, what are the technical, specific ramifications for the field? If it's a public audience, why should they care? What's most relevant to them? So I feel like those are basically just across the board good rules of thumb in my experience anyway. And then in terms of what's different, I think, it's different parts of what you're trying to convey will be more or less relevant. So if you're studying, for geomorphology, if you're studying how to improve a landscape evolution model or something that's very, equation based, the people in your field will be very interested to know how you parameterize different things. The public doesn't care. They care about, what are the risks? What are the real world implications? If they're buying a house, what should they consider? So I think, the motivations can be pretty different, I guess. Charlie, do you want to add?
Sure. Yeah, I think that's a great point. And I would, especially as a landscape evolution modeler, that really hits home for me, cuts me where it hurts. But I think your overall point is a really good one, which is that I think there are maybe less differences than we often think of, because you still, like Becca said, you need to have that motivation and not assume too much, whether it's in a JGR article or whether it's in a broadly accessible piece. So, in general, I view this more, I think, based on my experiences, as something we don't necessarily need to change as much about our writing for a broad audience. It's something I think most people need to change more about their writing for a technical audience in some cases. And, so I think that's kind of a key similarity between the two. And then in terms of the differences, for me, the big one that we're always running into is that jargon problem, or unknowable words, or words that are not necessarily even particularly complicated, but you just aren't going to know what they mean if you haven't gone through the sort of training rituals, right? And one I like to bring up for our field is base level, right? It's not a complicated word, it's not even crazy sounding, but its meaning is just kind of strange, and you would have to think about it for a while. So I think it's really that we want to have this motivating structure and not assuming too much background knowledge, no matter which direction we're going with our writing. And the key difference is kind of minimizing the use or explaining really thoroughly those kind of jargon, bits of jargon, or those unknowable words.
And I feel like, just to add on quickly, I feel like it does go beyond, specific terms or phrases to sort of, there are just whole sort of concepts or frameworks that we might automatically be working in that people in a different field or even like subfield just might not be familiar with. Like, I think many of us have been sitting in a technical session that's supposed to be in our field, and yet there are one or two talks where you're just like, oh, I don't I haven't heard of this at all. Like looking around, does anybody else know what this is? So I think jargon certainly is a gateway or a gatekeeping thing, but so are some like bigger ideas too.
Great. Thank you guys both so much. Do Amy or Catherine, do you have anything else you'd like to add to this before we move on to our next question? All right, then. Well, so we'll move on to our next question.
Yeah, so so basically I was curious, like piggybacking on the last question. So, and I would like to direct this to Amy and Kathy. So what do you look for when you decide which science to feature or highlight? Which science would like?
I can get that one started. So it's kind of this magic combination of you want something that's obviously scientifically important, but also something that catches somebody's eye. So maybe something surprising, something fun. All outlets are different. You know, some of them want cute animal stories, and that's fine. You know, if I have a cute animal story, I know I can go over there. But it is kind of, it forces me to think like a member of the public. You know, I kind of take off my scientist hat a little bit and I think, you know, if I was somebody picking up a newspaper, you know, what would I gravitate towards? What would catch my eye? So it is that combination of newsworthy, fun, unexpected, cute, scary sometimes. You know, what are kind of the base emotions that draw people in? And I try to think of those.
When we, answering as a journal editor, when we choose what papers from JGR that we're going to recommend AGU feature for special promotion, like for research spotlights, for editors highlights and EOS, and for extra promotion on AGU's Twitter account, for instance, we look for papers that are showing a significant new advance in understanding an important problem, a problem whose importance is easy to make the case for. Many types of problems are important, of course, and some inherently, I would say, have a broader appeal or at least a broader relevance than others. And so communicating the importance and the relevance of your work when you write a technical paper for a journal, in order to get the reviewer's attention, get the editor's attention as this is something that's special, this deserves extra promotion. A lot of that comes down to your paper's packaging. Putting your highest impact content early and easily visible throughout the paper to make the case. I've done something new, I've done something significant, and my problem is important. So putting your highest impact content early and easily visible. We also try, when we choose the editor's highlights and spotlights, we also try to choose some papers that are more theoretical than others with a clear societal application. So geohazards or climate change and so on. But it's not necessarily the case that your work would have to be practical rather than purely theoretical to get featured in that sense. We look for advances in all of those things.
Thanks so much. Those are two different perspectives, but it sort of aims towards the same thing. Becca, Charlie, do you want to add to that? Do you have anything to add to that?
Well, I was just going to ask, I'm just curious as well, because I'm sort of, you know, newer at this. How much, once you are sort of talking with someone, maybe, how much do you tend to want to incorporate the sort of personal aspect of a story as opposed to sort of a stricter focus on like, here's the new science versus like, this is some great work that this person is doing and here's how they got there and here's what went on behind the scenes? Because I feel like that sort of work can go a really long way in sort of humanizing science and helping people connect.
I definitely try to incorporate it. You know, if there's space in a story, I love to draw in the personal angle. That really gets readers interested. And as you said, it also humanizes science. It shows people that scientists aren't just people in white lab coats in the lab, you know, that they have motivations and interests. And, you know, I've definitely been doing interviews where a scientist has told me about amazing field work or, you know, serendipity, something that happened on field work that led to a cool discovery. And I love pulling those in. I think that's the best way to draw in readers and to show them that science is personal.
Thank you. Charlie, do you have anything to add to that?
Yeah, just a quick point. I think, you know, for me and my sort of SciComm outlet editor-in-chief hat, we can take a little bit of a different perspective in that because we don't pay people to write for us, there's not necessarily quite so much risk involved in choosing exactly what to highlight. So we leave it up to our authors to choose what papers they want to highlight. And largely they're writing about work that's come out in the last couple of years. And that's all we say. So, based on the past few months of our experiences, people tend to choose short papers, whether because the point is easier to find or because you have to read less to then write about it is not clear yet. But one thing that I've really enjoyed seeing our authors do is choosing papers that I think would typically get missed by more traditional outlets that often need that really clear application or really exciting factoid to pull on. And it's not always predictable for us which of the things we post is going to get the most traffic. It's not always the things you would think of as being the most flashy. And so one thing we really pride ourselves on, and part of our mission, is to comb through those kind of standard society journals that don't get as much press as the flashier, shorter ones, and kind of bring that work to light as well. And it's not always as clear as you might think what ends up getting the most interest from readers.
Thank you so much. Those are really interesting perspectives. Yeah, Claire.
Great. Yeah, thank you all. And so taking it back to Becca and Charlie here. So since both of you are straddle doing academic research and communicating that, and also doing more public-facing science communication, when you sit down to start any of your communication projects, whether they be academic or more public-facing, what are the first things you consider in coming up with a plan for how to communicate your message?
I mean, I think we sort of hit on it before, which is just thinking about sort of what is the most poignant motivation that the different audiences would relate the most to. So I actually just, I'm lucky I have a partner who's also in science. And so I can just go to him and be like, which of these three things is most interesting to you? Or I'll ask the undergrads who I work with in our lab, is this interesting to you? Do you care about this at all? So that's sort of that's a pretty informal approach, I would say, for starting out. But it really is, I think about what first got me interested in looking at it at all, and then taking a step back and saying, okay, was that my scientist hat, or was it my member of the public hat? And just it can be really hard to separate that out, especially when you're first starting out, maybe saying oh, this is newsworthy, and then you look at it, maybe the next day, and you're like, oh, this is a pretty nitty-gritty paper, in my field. I think maybe I had my scientist hat on. So just being sort of self-critical in that way, I think, is a good lens to start looking at stuff through. And then in terms of, I'm a big fan of the outline, always have been. So I really try and focus on, trying to find the lead, of course, but also thinking about, like we talked about before, sort of what level of complexity I want to end up getting to based on the audience, and then how to get there. What do I have to explain or set up in order to, if I do want to get into, this is why we parameterized, this is this, that requires a lot more setup and background knowledge than just saying landslides are a hazard that you should be concerned about. So I think that would probably, I think that's my sort of starting framework.
I think that's a really good point, and I don't have a ton to add to that. I definitely would echo the point about the motivation, right? And I've definitely, both in my academic writing and in my non-academic writing, have sort of gotten halfway through a piece of writing and said, man, I've really buried the lead. This is not good, and had to go from there and rework. And the other thing I spend a lot of time thinking about for both, and again, this is where I sort of think they maybe differ less than we often think they do, is just thinking about, and Becca got at this a little bit, what barriers am I going to have to break down for someone to understand this, right? What are the few key concepts that I need to make sure I explain kind of upfront? And there are kind of two separate ways you can go about that, right? And each one I kind of attribute to one of my favorite geoscience writers. So if you take the John McPhee approach, right, this Pulitzer Prize winning geology author, he typically will dodge really big words and things like that and just use fun descriptive language to get concepts across. So that's kind of one avenue. The other, which you could attribute to other people, including the paleontologist Steve Gould, is to say, I'm just going to define this term and then I'm just going to use it with reckless abandon and hope that people are paying enough attention to kind of internalize that. And I think this applies to both the academic and the non-academic writing. And that's where I spend a lot of my time, is thinking about kind of which of those directions I'm going to head and what specific concepts need that test applied to them.
And I think, excuse me, both of those sort of approaches or tools that you just described both do a good job of pulling people in, but in a different way, because in any writing, whether it's academic or for the public, you want to bring people along. It's not like you're just telling them things. You want to invite them to really be invested in the story and to learn something, so they come away with a feeling of like, oh, I not only like I learned a factoid, but I understand this sort of concept or field a little bit better. Because everybody likes to feel included and part of an in-group. And so if we can do that through writing or through a podcast or through writing some really good highlights for your academic paper, which I feel like all journals should require, maybe along with just a question of like, why should the public care about this? That would be great, but that's tangential. I may have just lost my train of thought. Yep, it's gone. But I think I said what I wanted to say.
Great. Thank you, Becca. And thank you, Charlie. Catherine or Amy, anything to add to that? All right, excellent. So then we'll move on to our next question for our panelists.
Thank you, Claire. So Catherine, as a science journalist, and Amy as a journal editor, I think you have seen this a lot. And so I'll just move on to our next questions. So what are the most common challenges that you have seen scientists face in communicating their science? And what are some of the suggestions that you have so that they can overcome that, or what we should keep in mind, or we as a community should keep in mind to overcome those challenges?
So I interview a lot of scientists for the stories that I work on. And a common theme is that they often want to tell me all about their methods. What were the lab methods that they did? And I understand that. As a scientist myself, I'm proud of what I did. It takes up a lot of my time. But as a journalist, what I'm really after is the big picture. What is the motivation? What are the implications? What is the impact on somebody who's not a scientist? So my biggest piece of advice is to try to curb that desire to tell me all about your methods, and instead take a step back and kind of break it down, saying, here's my motivation. Here's why I did this. And by the way, I did all these methods. I can tell you all about them if you want, but get me started with the big picture, because then that will really help me better understand your work and help me think of better questions to ask to get at the newsworthiness, the applications. And then we can talk about the methods at the end, I promise. But let's, start with the bigger picture. That's more helpful.
I couldn't agree more. That was so well said. I mean, it's interesting. We have very similar answers to this question, and coming from very different perspectives, which is interesting, as an interviewer versus the journal editor who would love to see your work get into publishable shape. I would say, yeah. So the packaging of research into a technical journal manuscript is fairly challenging for most of us. And as an editor, I find myself saying similar messages over and over to authors. No matter what the subject is, I often end up recommending to authors, you need to put your highest impact content more prominently. And I can share some examples. These may sound somewhat subjective, and they're based on personal preference. They don't fit all paper situations, but my preferences have developed over handling hundreds of technical papers. And I find there are communication patterns in journal papers that can stack the deck toward making your case more clearly to reviewers. And I think they're very similar to what Catherine just mentioned. For instance, when authors are planning what goes into each paragraph, put your strongest stuff first and make it obvious. Strong topic sentences to start each paragraph, and have that big picture context at the top of your paper, at the top of the abstract. Readers and reviewers and editors are really looking for what you've done that's a new and significant advance on an important problem. So you want to make that easy for them to find. For instance, you could start your abstract of your paper saying, here's a big fundamental problem in our field. We investigated that problem in this field area or developed this new model. And we show for the first time that so-and-so. Doing that is much more effective than leading with your field area, or as you mentioned, to lead with your methods. Many abstracts from field-based scientists instead start with the field area. You know, people write, the Smith River of Northern California flows through metacentury rocks of the so-and-so formation, and we went there to measure something. Well, you love your field area. I might love it too, but in most cases, leading with that doesn't engage readers easily if they don't work in that area, or if they're just looking immediately for what advance you've made. It's more effective to lead with a big picture problem and then get to the field area or your new method. You'll get there, but get to it after you've told them why this is really important. Or to start a paragraph in the results of your paper with, our data show this exciting new result, figure 3, is more effective than leading with, figure 3 shows X plotted against Y, figure 4 shows this against that, And then you have to clearly link those findings to the big picture context. Writing scientific papers effectively is challenging because the details that we authors care deeply about, others are going to see as weeds. You're lost in the weeds. The weeds, you're going to describe the weeds in there, but the solution is, even when we have to describe those deeply technical details, to focus on making that highest impact content easy to find.
Thank you so much. Those are great points, more so when I started writing right now. And this is what I get. The feedback from my advisor is always like, I understand you spend so much time with doing your work and the methods, but no one cares. And I think that's a great way to put it there in my head. Thank you so much. So Charlie, Becca, do you have anything to add to this? Okay, thank you. So we will move on to our next question.
All right. So our next question moves to the World Wide Web, and we'll start with Amy and Becca for this question. So Twitter specifically, and social media more broadly, has begun to play a larger and larger role in communicating science, both in our professional networks and to the broader public. And so what role do you see social media platforms and Twitter specifically being used for science communication going into the future?
I can start with that if that's all right. I know that I learned a lot from the EPSP community and the broader community of scientists on Twitter to find out about new work. It's a very effective tool when people post about their work or their own perspectives on current science. Social media definitely can help the visibility of journal papers, and it helps to disseminate authors' work, but I find that it doesn't happen in an equitable way, and I can explain. So from a journal editor's perspective, in addition to AGU promoting some papers through they have the EOS Twitter account, they have Sharing Science, the AGU SciComm account. In addition to promoting some papers that way, JGR or Surface also tweets about every new paper that we publish. We started doing that 2 years ago. And that helps some papers' visibility a lot, we find, and it helps some very little in terms of increased downloads and views of their papers. We find that what happens next after the journal tweets about a paper depends on who picks up on it. If a new paper is getting liked or retweeted by one of the cool people on Twitter, so a user who has maybe 10,000 followers and who tweets frequently, so they're featured prominently in users' feeds, if one of those users starts tweeting about a paper, then many other people see it, many other people start retweeting it, and it's more likely to be seen by a journalist too. But a paper that doesn't get noticed by a Twitter super user won't get that visibility, even though it came from the same source account. It was the same journal that tweeted the paper. So, and then also authors who aren't on Twitter have less opportunity to promote their work. For instance, authors in China can't access Twitter. Many of their close colleagues usually can't either. And so unless other users are amplifying social media posts about work by Chinese authors, those papers won't get as much exposure in the international community. So I would say that social media is doing a great service to some authors' work now, but it's not happening in an equitable way. And what can we do about that? We can retweet work that we think deserves attention. It's worth mentioning also that within China, there are other social media networks that are used within China, and that there is additional promotion of journal content on, but I don't even see data about what happens with it, and it's not connected to the Twitter community, for instance.
Yeah, I actually, I have a somewhat academic interest in the use of Twitter for science communication. And so a couple of things, like Amy mentioned, Twitter, it can be really hard actually to reach an outside audience. So basically, if you're a scientist, it can be difficult to reach that stage where if people are retweeting or sharing a tweet that is, some of your new work, I think the threshold that a couple of studies have found is around 1,000 followers, and is when you can start to break out of your little sphere. That's really hard to reach, especially for, in academia, science communication and outreach work is just not valued in like a quantitative way. And so if people choose to take that on, that's extra work. And that's sort of, again, a separate conversation about academia and hierarchy. But an additional thing, I actually, as sort of a side project, a while ago looked into basically gender and race data for academics on Twitter in a couple of fields that tend to get shared. So like paleontology, ecology, and sort of disasters. And it was, there were a couple of interesting things really dominated by white women, which the National Association of Science Writers actually just put out a release or a new demographic data, I guess, showing that their membership for science journalists is also quite white. And so, yeah, I think these factors just speak to like who is more active in doing the science communication intersects with who ends up benefiting in an academic way. Yeah, so I think, and another issue with sort of social media is just how you choose to use it. I know some people who just have completely separate personal versus professional accounts, and those just serve very different roles. So if you're trying to basically only amplify your work to a scientific audience, that's a lot easier than basically branding yourself as a scientist who wants to engage with the public. And I would be curious to hear from Catherine, maybe, should academics try to get a sense for which journalists at outlets they would like to talk to, maybe like would be interested in covering their work and just tagging them once they get a sense for the work that they do? Or I feel like a flip side of that could be journalists getting tagged for completely unrelated stuff by academics who basically haven't done the work to see who's most appropriate to contact.
Absolutely. So as a journalist, and particularly as a freelance journalist, I am always looking for story ideas. So I love it when scientists reach out to me. I'll admit that a large fraction of people who contact me don't get stories written about their work. It's just either A, not newsworthy, it's not a good fit for the publications I write for. But I really, really appreciate when scientists reach out to me. And the best way to do that is just a short and sweet email. Tell me what your new result is, attach your paper so I can read it. Make it easy for me, paint the picture of why this is something that I should cover. And again, it's really, really appreciated. I always encourage scientists to reach out to me and to reach out to other journalists. We love it.
And another thought, just in terms of putting social media to use, would be developing connections with your institution's press office. Because if you're doing cool work that you think could be shared, but as academics, we don't get trained in having the tools to reach out to journalists or to develop these stories. And so just relying on the institutional tools that do already exist, you can leverage those networks and connections and basically have someone who is trained in doing that, and that's their job, to write a press release for your work, to contact people, journalists who they might already know. You can say, hey, like, this is cool work going on, you should talk to this scientist, here's a press release. That just takes some of the onus off of individual scientists. There's actually another study that just came out looking at science communication training in institutions. And while it's patchy, and it also basically teaches academics about communications, but doesn't give them the tools to then go out and do that themselves, or to tell them these are some outlets that you should look at, these are the networks that you need to build. So right now we're sort of in this in-between step where we're starting to become aware basically that academics could and should be doing this work, but we're not yet at the level of support maybe that we need so that everybody can be on Twitter and, you know, promoting their work or working with their press offices.
Great. Thank you, everyone, for your answers on that. Charlie, I don't know if you want to add anything before we move on?
Sure, just really quickly, I can provide maybe just a little bit of data about how Twitter helps us promote posts on GeoBytes or new writing. And it drives between 50 and 70% of the web traffic that comes to a given post. And that percentage has actually even grown, even though our kind of Google hits are improving. We're crawling up the search results, but actually that percentage has grown as our number of Twitter followers goes up. So that really gets back to Becca's point of we have this kind of key goal of trying to punch through that number of followers where we're actually confident we're not only reaching other Earth scientists. So that's kind of goal number one for us right now, based on the data showing that Twitter is really driving the vast majority of our traffic.
Great. Thank you, Charlie. And thanks to everyone for your answers on that. So we do appear to have some time left. So we are going to move to the Q&A section to take audience questions. As a reminder, please, if you have any questions for our panelists, throw them up in the Q&A and we will try and get through them in the next 15 minutes or so.
Yeah, we'll just move on to the first question from the audience, and it's from Deirdre Ryan. For all panelists, there seems to be a push for scientists to be able to communicate their science effectively to the public. However, we aren't trained for that. What are your thoughts on this, and how should science communication to the public develop? Whoever can jump in with your.
I mean, I was just talking about this a little bit, but I will just say, like, I think science communication classes should be required in basically starting in undergrad, definitely required in grad school. And then, as I think I mentioned before, we just need to start actually valuing this sort of outreach and communication work in departments, so that rather than viewing it as a burden or extra work that people feel they have to do to get ahead, especially maybe people who have, you know, historically been marginalized within academia, if we just need to, you know, consider that when we're hiring people, when we're doing tenure. I think that's a really critical part in pushing ahead science communication from an academic perspective.
I wanted to ask, I know that in the past during the AGU fall meeting, AGU has actually put together some training opportunities as side events during the fall meeting. And I don't know what they did in this past year with everything virtual, but does anyone want to explain some of AGU's opportunities or any that happen outside of fall meeting? Because I'm interested myself.
I can comment that at least this year I saw a Sketch Your Science webinar that was going on as a way to communicate your science and also distill your science down into its most basic elements. But yeah, Amy, you're right. There certainly are some of those trainings, so we can try and look and put some on the EPSP resources webpage if anything's available.
I think that's a great idea.
Yeah, I think maybe just to add one more thing, I definitely agree with Becca that one key point here is just incentivizing people to do this. You know, I'm really fortunate to be at an institution where when someone saw I was doing this essentially side project or hobby, they said, oh, well, no, you don't need to do these extra service requirements because you're already doing this science communication thing. And, you know, that's not the norm right now. I think it's safe to say. And so I think pushing for that, I'm very fortunate to have that, and pushing for that more generally, I think is one big step. And the other thing is just, there are plenty of low stakes environments where you can practice, and I'll just plug one, which is GeoBytes, right? We don't pay you, but the stakes are low. I've sent a lot of bad first drafts to peer editors, and I've learned a lot about the science writing process just through that.
I would also plug, so NPR actually has a science communication training program specifically for academics who would like to improve their science communication skills, typically for sort of communicating with the public, but really, for whatever purpose. That's really fantastic. It's a really supportive and friendly group that I highly recommend you check out. And then, like Charlie said, like it varies, campus to campus, but there are probably some science communication opportunities either on your campus or at a campus nearby that you could get involved with that are low stakes. So for example, on my campus, we just have a group that's called Michigan Science Writers. And it's this peer editing driven program where grad students or undergrads can just practice science writing. And another opportunity, sorry, mine are more geared towards grad students, I think. But there are the science communication conference series basically that are hosted at different universities every year, I think at this point. And so those are also worth checking out to see if you have one, again, like on your campus or nearby. And the NPR thing is open for any level.
And also probably more towards graduate students, but if you have an opportunity to be a TA, that's science communication. If you're teaching an Astro 101 course, like I did many times, I learned how to break things down for people who are not astronomers and frankly have no interest in being an astronomer, but are taking a class that they need to take. So don't forget about teaching. That's still a great opportunity.
Yeah, definitely. Thank you everyone for your answers on that. So we have another audience question from Sarah O'Keefe, and she said, regarding the put high impact first model, I think a lot of junior scientists are very hesitant to make big claims like we found this, and prefer much more hesitant statements like our findings suggest this, maybe. And so how do we communicate that uncertainty without losing the impact of our science?
Sure, I'd be happy to answer that. It's a great question. And yeah, making your impacts visible and easy to find shouldn't be conflated with overstating the level of certainty you have. It's absolutely fine to write statements like our findings suggest that, or so on. We surmise that. I've used that in papers before. You have to choose those carefully. But the key thing is to make it easy to find, not to bury it in many, many sentences of figure X shows this. We want to be able to see what you've done, skimming even the top of the abstract, the start of the discussion, looking at the conclusions, looking at a couple of figure captions, rather than having to wade through less impactful stuff to get to the nuggets. So if the nuggets are, we think this is what's going on, but there's a lot of uncertainty, that's fine. If that's what you found, that's fine. We just need to be able to find that easily.
Catherine or Becca, have you experienced that a similar uncertainty in when you interview scientists, and how do you get around that or get through that when you're chatting with them?
Yeah, very much so. I've had people who are pretty hesitant, who are, present their results, but say, here, we're not totally sure, there's big uncertainty. And I try to present that I will convey that, that I think a disservice that science journalism sometimes does is we say, this is answer X and we know X precisely. So I do try to convey that science is an iterative process, that we're always trying to hone in on getting smaller and smaller error bars. But it's a challenge because, most of the public doesn't want to read about error bars. That's not interesting. So it's a delicate balance of how do you convey that something is not known perfectly, but not talk about this is a 3 sigma result.
Yeah, and I feel like I've actually been thinking about this a lot just in the context of sort of misinformation around COVID and everything. I feel like the more we sort of talk about, like Catherine said, the iterative process that is science that we as scientists are quite used to and familiar talking about, it can be maybe, you know, alarming or disconcerting for members of the public if they, you know, read something that is then like improved upon essentially, but it can come across as like, oh, like they were wrong, or this paper got retracted, and you know, what does that mean? And science education and literacy is certainly not the answer to everything, and science communication can only go so far in terms of some of these really polarizing issues. But you know, communicating uncertainty in an honest way, I think is really important. And yeah, I'm actually working with someone now who is going to be writing their own piece, but they were really like, you know, I don't want this to come across as like attacking these farmers for polluting and, you know, like putting all the blame on them. And it's like, of course not, you know? So I think on a personal level, if you're talking to a scientist or a journalist or whoever, just making that connection and just, you know, being clear in your own communications that you don't have some nefarious goal to misrepresent their work to get the most clickbaity headline, you know, just like, no, I really want to honestly communicate what you're doing here. I think can go a long way.
Great, thank you. Charlie, anything to add?
No, I think that was really great. That covered it for me.
Excellent. So then I think we have time for one more audience question, and then we have one final question for the panelists to wrap up.
Yeah, so the next question, it's an anonymous question, and the question is, what are the ways the panel recommends for the public to ask scientists their questions? Where should scientists look to see this input?
Maybe I can start. I do try to respond to emails, you know, both from other scientists. I occasionally fail to do that, and also equally from the public. And you know, emails are hard, but I guess I would say one thing is not to be afraid to just reach out directly to somebody. I'm you know, usually way more excited that somebody has read something I've written than I am kind of scared about whether they're criticizing me or you know, anything like that. So, you know, I wouldn't leave that option off the table, even if there is no centralized hub for doing that.
Yeah, it's a good question, because I think as scientists, we know enough other scientists who work on related topics or would know someone who would, that we understand that process. If we had a question about an unrelated field, we could say, oh, well, I've got a friend at so-and-so university. There's someone in their department that does this. You could probably figure out who to go to for those questions. But a non-scientist member of the public, what do they do? I mean, I'm curious. I know that I work for the USGS, and the USGS has a feature on their website called Ask a Scientist. And the public can type in questions there, and then hopefully someone is paying attention at the USGS headquarters and will field it to the right person in our 10,000 person agency. But I don't know how to do that for other fields, other than for people who don't have the, you know, the connections of, well, I've got a friend who might work on that.
I've sometimes gotten queries from readers who have read a story of mine, and I talked about a scientist that I interviewed, and they want to get in contact, and I'm happy to pass along email. So you can reach out to a journalist who wrote a story.
And just Twitter, you know, it's like we talked about earlier, having that sphere can be an issue, you know, having a sphere of influence where you can know who to contact. But I feel like I've definitely seen questions from Twitter from lay people, basically just like, you know, geology friends, like, what's up with this? And then that gets passed along and somebody answers it. And Reddit, maybe not so great an example, because most of those are, what is this gray rock? And everyone's like, it's a geode, or, you know, just like, okay, it's not. But I think social media is useful in that way as well.
Great, thank you. Yeah, I'll share a short personal story here. We very often get people that call our department because they think they have found meteorites. And so that, or are asking for rock identification. So an email goes out from our front office staff to all of the faculty with like pictures of rocks to be like, does anyone know what this is? Which is pretty fun. I usually cannot help, but all right. So we have reached almost the end of our hour. So first off, thank you to all four of our panelists for participating today. And then we're gonna give you the last 2 minutes in case there's anything you want to plug, whether it be science communication related or anything else. The floor is yours, and we can start with Catherine.
So I'll plug that I have a list of tips and tricks for beginning journalists that lives on my website, which is just my first and last name.com, catherinecornai.com. And I love fielding questions. I often chat with people over email and phone, people who are interested in getting into science communication, who want to understand what being a science journalist is all about. So feel free to reach out. I'm very happy to chat.
Okay, great. Amy, you want to go for it?
Sure. I was just actually, I can sort of respond to a question in the chat from Risa. How important is prior visibility for early career scientists work for reviewers? And the question deals with interacting at conferences about a work that may be submitted. It probably depends on the individual case, but I would be happy to talk further with anybody who might have a question about submitting their work to JGR or Surface or any other journal. I can happy to provide my perspective. It might be easier to talk offline since we're out of time, but feel free to contact me. I put my email address in the chat answer. It's aeast@usgs.gov.
I would just plug the NPR program again in case you sort of missed it. If you just Google NPR SciComm, it should pop up. And another site that was useful for me when I was basically feeling this out is Massive Science. They basically publish a lot of work from grad students or current academics, as well as some journalists. And it is, it is a public facing outlet, but it's a really friendly, supportive environment. And you get, it's a nice editorial process for, if you've maybe done some on-campus work and are ready to move up to that sort of next level, it's a good place to sort of dip your toes in.
Great. Just to finish up, I definitely agree with Becca. I was a participant in this NPR program, wrote something for Scientific American. It was really fun. And they even pay a little bit, which is also cool. The other thing I'll plug is please, consider writing for GeoBytes or an Associated Bytes site. We have these for all disciplines, depending on what you are most interested in, especially if you're interested in bringing to light work that might not otherwise get highlighted, because we are the practicing scientists, right? So this is a great chance, and I'm happy to talk over email with anybody who's interested in that. Thanks a lot for organizing.
Thank you so much to everyone. That was a great panel. I personally gained a lot of insights. I hope the audience did too. The recording of this is on YouTube, so the audience or anyone who wants to see this can see this in their leisure. And we will also put up something on the resources about the SciComm opportunities. And yes, I hope to keep in touch. Thank you so much.
Yes, thank you. And we will be back next month with EPSP Connects for a science talk. So stay tuned for that. You can see information for how to register on our EPSP website or on Twitter. So hope to see you back next time. And thanks everybody again.
Thank you so much, everyone.